A biting wind howled through the barren mountains of Afghanistan, carrying with it the weight of centuries. The icy terrain stretched endlessly, the jagged peaks piercing the gray sky like ancient sentinels. In this desolate expanse, two figures trudged forward, their steps slow and deliberate, each breath visible in the freezing air. Wrapped in layers of rough wool, they seemed almost swallowed by the vastness around them. But their resolve was evident in the way they leaned into the wind, side by side. Rahim, his weathered face hidden beneath a thick scarf, glanced at Farah. Despite the harshness of their surroundings, her eyes carried a quiet determination. She clutched a small bundle to her chest, a collection of tools, dried herbs, and a few relics from their past life. He knew she wouldn't complain about the journey. She never had. Even in their youth, Farah had been the steadier one, the one who found purpose in hardship. The cave was near. It wasn't visible yet, but Rahim could feel its presence, like a memory embedded in the landscape. He'd heard stories about this place from his grandfather, a sanctuary carved by nature, used by travelers and nomads over centuries. Now, it was to be their refuge, their attempt to return to the life their ancestors once led, stripped of modern conveniences and the chaos of the outside world. The first sight of the entrance came as they rounded a craggy hill. The opening was small, almost hidden, framed by icicles that gleamed faintly in the muted light. Rahim stepped ahead and reached out, brushing the edges with his gloved hand. A chill seeped through the fabric, but he pushed forward, holding the flap of cloth aside for Farah. She ducked her head and entered without a word. Inside, the air was slightly warmer, though the damp stone walls exuded an almost oppressive cold. The space was narrow at first, but widened further in, revealing a chamber with a ceiling high enough to stand. Natural light filtered through a small crevice above, casting pale streaks across the rough floor. Rahim set down his pack and began arranging their sparse belongings: a flint, a metal pot, and a few animal hides for bedding. Farah knelt nearby, carefully unwrapping the bundle she carried. Her hands, thin but steady, revealed a wooden bowl filled with a mixture of dried fruits and nuts, a gift from a kind stranger they'd met along the way. She set it beside the fire pit Rahim was building. He struck the flint with practiced efficiency, and soon a small flame flickered to life. The warmth, faint as it was, brought a sense of relief. "This cave," Rahim began, his voice low but steady, "has seen more winters than we can count. Imagine the stories these walls could tell." Farah smiled faintly, brushing a strand of gray hair from her face. "Perhaps they've been waiting for us to add ours." They ate in silence, savoring each bite of the simple meal. Outside, the wind screamed against the mountain, but the fire crackled softly, a fragile barrier against the cold. As the flames danced, their shadows stretched across the walls, merging and separating like ghosts of the past. Rahim leaned back, his gaze fixed on the faint light coming through the crevice above. "Do you ever think about what we left behind?" Farah looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "I think about what we found instead. Out there, everything is loud, fast, fleeting. Here, every moment matters. Every breath feels earned." Her words hung in the air, as tangible as the smoke curling from the fire. Rahim nodded slowly, his hand reaching out to cover hers. For a moment, the years between them seemed to fade, and they were simply two souls, bound by love and a shared purpose. The fire burned low, and Farah began arranging the hides for sleeping. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her movements practiced but unhurried. Rahim watched her, a pang of admiration stirring in his chest. She had always been this way, strong, grounded, unshaken by the storms life had thrown their way. As they lay down, the silence of the cave wrapped around them, broken only by the distant whistle of the wind outside. Rahim closed his eyes, feeling the rough stone beneath him and the warmth of Farah beside him. He thought of the generations before them who had lived and survived in conditions like these. He thought of the life they had chosen to leave behind, a life of distractions, noise, and shallow comforts. This was different. Here, every decision, every action carried weight. The cold was relentless, the resources scarce, but in this simplicity, there was something profound. Farah's voice, soft and steady, broke through his thoughts. Do you think they'd be proud? The ones who came before us. Rahim turned to her, his hand finding hers in the darkness. I think they'd understand, and maybe that's enough. As sleep took them, the cave seemed to hum with an ancient energy, as if welcoming them into its long history. Outside, the wind raged on, but inside, two hearts beat in quiet defiance, ready to face whatever the next day would bring. The first rays of daylight seeped through the narrow crevice above the cave, illuminating the jagged stone walls and the remnants of last night's fire. Rahim stirred awake, his joints aching from the cold that no amount of animal hides could fully keep at bay. He glanced over at Farah, already awake and busy sorting through their meager supplies. Her movements were deliberate, her focus sharp. She had always been the practical one, never wasting energy on anything unnecessary. Their day began like every other since arriving at the cave, with the rhythm of survival dictating their actions. Rahim ventured outside, his breath forming dense clouds in the freezing air. He scanned the horizon for signs of life, his eyes squinting against the glare of the sun reflecting off the snow. The landscape was as barren as ever, the silence almost oppressive, but he couldn't afford to return empty-handed. Farah, meanwhile, busied herself with tasks inside the cave. She knelt near the fire pit, carefully melting snow in their metal pot. The water, though tinged with minerals, was a lifeline. She measured every drop with precision, knowing that waste was not an option. As she worked, her mind wandered to memories of their old life. A life where water flowed freely from taps, where food could be bought with the swipe of a card. The contrast was stark, but she didn't regret their decision. Rahim returned just before midday, carrying a small bundle wrapped in his scarf. He unwrapped it to reveal a handful of roots and berries, barely enough for a proper meal. Farah didn't comment. She simply took the bundle and began preparing what little they had. They shared the unspoken understanding that complaints served no purpose here. As the fire crackled softly, they ate in silence, their shared glances speaking volumes. The meager meal was a testament to their resilience, a victory, however small, against the odds. Farah broke the silence first, her voice steady but thoughtful. It's strange, isn't it? How quickly you realize how little you actually need. Rahim nodded, chewing slowly. Strange, but also freeing. Out here, everything matters. Every bite, every step, every breath. The weight of his words hung in the air. Outside, the wind had begun to pick up again, its haunting whistle a constant reminder of the world's indifference to their struggle. The harshness of the environment wasn't their only challenge. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each day bleeding into the next with little variation. The isolation tested their patience, their endurance, and, at times, their bond. There were moments when the silence between them felt heavy, the unspoken fears and frustrations threatening to surface. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Rahim let out a frustrated sigh. I wonder if this is what they felt, the ones who lived like this before us. If they questioned why they kept going. Farah looked at him, her expression soft but firm. They didn't question it because they didn't have a choice. And neither do we. This is the life we chose, Rahim. Not because it's easy, but because it's real. Her words were a balm, grounding him in a way that only she could. He nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. You're right. And maybe that's why we're still here. Because we're stronger than we think. Their struggles weren't limited to the emotional toll. The physical challenges were relentless, each day presenting a new obstacle. One morning, Rahim ventured deeper into the mountains in search of firewood, only to find himself caught in a sudden snowstorm. The wind howled around him, blinding and unyielding, and for a moment, he thought he might not make it back. But the thought of Farah waiting for him in the cave pushed him forward, his every step fueled by determination. When he finally stumbled back into the cave, frost clinging to his beard and his hands trembling from the cold, Farah rushed to his side. She didn't scold him or ask unnecessary questions. Instead, she guided him to the fire, her hands steady as she rubbed warmth back into his frozen fingers. "You scared me," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "I scared myself," Rahim admitted, his voice hoarse. "But I couldn't stop thinking about you, about how we've come this far together. I couldn't let it end like that." Farah didn't reply, but the way she held his gaze spoke volumes. In that moment, the unspoken bond between them felt stronger than ever, forged in the crucible of their shared struggle. As the days turned into weeks, their routines became second nature. Farah discovered a patch of herbs growing near the edge of a frozen stream, their resilience a small miracle in the harsh environment. She carefully harvested them, adding a new flavor to their otherwise bland meals. Rahim began carving tools from wood and bone, his hands finding a rhythm in the repetitive task. At night, as the firelight danced across the cave walls, they would share stories. Rahim spoke of his grandfather's tales, of the nomads who had roamed these mountains centuries ago. Farah, in turn, shared memories of their youth, of the life they'd once dreamed of building together. Their laughter, though rare, became a precious sound in the stillness of the cave. It was a reminder that even in the face of adversity, there was joy to be found. And in those moments, the cold, the hunger, and the isolation seemed to fade, replaced by the warmth of their connection. Each day was a battle, but it was a battle they fought together. They weren't just surviving. They were reclaiming something deeper, something that had been lost in the noise of the modern world. In the coldest, most unforgiving place, they were finding their way back to what truly mattered. The snowstorm had raged through the night, its fury shaking the mountains with relentless howls and blinding flurries. When it finally subsided, the world outside the cave emerged as a pristine, untouched expanse of white. The air was still, the kind of stillness that only comes after nature has unleashed its full power. Rahim and Farah stood at the cave entrance, bundled tightly against the cold, marveling at the landscape. The storm had left everything sharper, clearer, as though the mountains themselves had been reborn. Rahim stepped forward, his boots crunching in the deep snow. He scanned the horizon, his eyes landing on the distant peaks shrouded in mist. "It's strange," he said quietly, "to see so much destruction and beauty in the same place." Farah joined him, her breath forming soft clouds. "The mountains don't apologize for being what they are," she replied. "They're harsh and unyielding, but they've stood the test of time. That's their way of surviving." Rahim glanced at her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Maybe that's why we came here, to learn from them." They spent the morning gathering what the storm had scattered. Broken branches littered the ground, offering much-needed firewood. Farah collected chunks of ice to melt, her fingers numb despite the thick gloves. Every task required effort, every action a deliberate choice, but there was a rhythm to their work now, a quiet understanding that kept them moving. As the day wore on, Rahim began assembling a small monument outside the cave. Using stones and branches, he constructed a simple structure, a cairn to mark their presence, to honor the lives that had come before them. Farah watched from a distance, her eyes soft with admiration. She knew this was his way of connecting with the past, of leaving something behind in a world that often forgot its own history. When he finished, he stepped back and wiped his hands on his coat. "It's not much," he said, almost apologetically. Farah shook her head. "It's enough. It says we were here, that we lived." Later, while searching for kindling near the base of a frozen stream, Farah stumbled upon something buried beneath the ice. She knelt down, her fingers brushing away the frost, revealing a small, weathered object, an ancient piece of pottery, its surface etched with faint patterns. She held it up to the light, her breath catching at the sight. Rahim approached, his curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Farah turned the pottery over in her hands, tracing the delicate lines with her thumb. "It's a piece of history," she said softly. Proof that someone else stood here just like us, trying to survive. The discovery felt profound, a reminder that their struggles were not unique but part of a larger story. It grounded them, giving their journey a deeper sense of purpose. As Raheem studied the artifact, he felt a surge of gratitude, not just for the life they had chosen, but for the connection it gave them to those who had come before. That evening, as the fire crackled and the wind murmured faintly outside, they sat together in quiet reflection. The artifact rested between them, its presence a silent testament to resilience. Raheem poked at the fire, sending sparks into the air. "Do you think they were happy?" he asked, nodding toward the pottery. "The ones who lived like this before us." Farah considered the question, her gaze fixed on the flames. Happiness might not have been their goal, she said finally. Maybe it was enough just to endure, to know they could face the world as it was and survive. Raheem nodded slowly, her words resonating deeply. "And maybe," he added, "that's its own kind of happiness. To feel alive, even in the hardest moments." The firelight danced across the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to tell their own stories. Farah reached out and took Raheem's hand, her touch warm and steady. "We've done more than survive, Raheem. We've found each other again. That's what matters." Her words brought a lump to his throat, but he swallowed it down, squeezing her hand in silent agreement. In the coldest place they had ever known, they had discovered a warmth that could not be extinguished. As the night deepened, they lay side by side, gazing up at the sliver of stars visible through the crevice above. The vastness of the universe pressed down on them, yet it didn't feel overwhelming. Instead, it felt like a reminder of their place in something far greater than themselves. Raheem broke the silence, his voice soft but firm. "In the end, it's not the world that shapes us. It's how we choose to face it." Farah turned her head toward him, her expression serene. "And we've chosen to face it together." Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deep and dreamless. The cave seemed to cradle them, its walls holding the echoes of their lives. Outside, the wind carried on, indifferent yet constant, a reminder that the mountains endured long before them and would continue long after. But for now, they had carved out their place in its history, leaving behind something more lasting than footprints in the snow. They had found meaning in the struggle, purpose in the simplicity, and love in the coldest of places.